Greetings and welcome to another Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team video. Today I'm going over Patreon requested content, which is terrain for Kill Team. So I'll be going through how to set up terrain for Kill Team to make balanced boards, reflecting on the rules I use which you can implement at home. But before we get into things, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of the video and what you'd like to see in the future. Did it help or did it not? Just anything in general. And if you want, I've got a Discord you can check out down in the episode description below for free, as well as a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. But yeah, today's video is one of my monthly Patreon requested ones. So these are for my Adepts of the Crit and above, so they can request once a month any piece of content they want me to cover, and if they all vote for it, I'll cover it. So they voted for terrain because I actually get a lot of questions about it, and I know a lot of people have, you know, done videos, but I've never really done anything myself because I thought that was all sufficient. But a lot of people have been asking for my input, so I decided to do it. And basically I'm going to go over the core principles that I do when I go to making terrain and boards, and how you can implement that at home. Like, I've got a lot of experience on battle reports because it's not really too clear in the rulebook. It's a bit misleading. They kind of give you some vague examples, you know, like what's a bad setup and what kind of looks like a good setup. And I'll be covering like symmetrical, asymmetrical, all of that. You know, I've done a lot of help with some tournaments as well. But let me get into the core of it. So first off, do you go asymmetrical or symmetrical? So symmetrical is basically having mirrored deployments, whereas asymmetrical is having basically non-mirrored board styles. So the attacker and defender will have differentiating terrain, whether it may just be a mild two pieces of change, or, you know, drastically where everything's completely different. And actually, there's no real difference. So I remember Killstream, he did a lot of like data coverage from his own tournaments, and he found that there was actually no real difference between doing symmetrical and asymmetrical. Now, he was using fixed ITC formats with his kind of ITC terrain, which does kind of change things, but overall there was no real difference. And personally, I prefer asymmetrical, but it's fine to go with symmetrical. The only downside with symmetrical terrain is that there's no real downside to being the attacker. Like, there's a downside to being the defender because, well, all you get is that now you don't have priority when it comes to scouting ties in terms of deciding who goes first. So it makes the roll off for who's attacker and defender kind of more important than it should be. But generally all the missions support it from the current pack. The only difference is if you're playing Master of the Terminals, it heavily punishes a defending player in symmetrical terrain because of how the mission works, because the attacker gets to choose to turn off which piece of terrain. And if you're the defender, because defenders get to pick boards first, they basically pick their side on symmetrical terrain and going, well, and now I'm doubly disadvantaged for going second as well, being the defender to picking board sides. But if you're going with asymmetrical, try and not make it too crazy. I think what I see sometimes is people go too far with asymmetrical terrain and they make too much of a difference where it's just all kind of a jumble where stuff is in random places for the sake of just being randomly placed. But you still need some guidance when you're placing terrain. So after you've decided whether to go asymmetrical or symmetrical, I have some core principles that I stick to when I make my boards. So the key things are: always set up the objectives first, because that's how you should, then terrain. Never mix that up, never put the terrain, then the objectives, because it can make things quite difficult, especially if you've got large range objective discs that are showing you the full range for objectives. Always make sure your terrain is placed so that Tac Ops are scorable. So the key ones you need to keep in mind are central control and vantage. So central control is you need to be within blue, so 3 inches of the center, and more than your opponent. And vantage, you need to be able to do the vantage action on 2 different vantage points that aren't within your drop zone or wholly within. So some missions it's quite difficult. Like, I think the most difficult one is Dominion, because the drop zone's so deep, 9 inches, and even escalating hostilities can be quite of a trouble. But generally you want 3 to 5 vantage points on a board. I like to go no more than 4 if I can. I think 3 is a little bit sparse, but 4 is a nice middle ground. and you don't really want any vantage points touching the drop zones. So vantage is scorable. Maybe if you're running like 5 or 4 vantage points, you can have 1 touching the drop zone, just to make it so like if you're the defender, you can go, I'm going to play vantage. I'm going to pick this side so it's easier for me, or I'm going to pick the side where the drop zone has a vantage point in it for my opponent, so they have a harder time scoring vantage. And then, like, because another thing I like to do, which I'll cover in a minute, is putting terrain in the middle to block line of sight. So you don't want to put a big block covering like with a 3-inch, greater than a 3-inch bubble in the middle of the board, because while it does greatly block off line of sight, it can also make central control unscorable. So you can have something on in the middle of the board, but you don't want something blocking off an entire section and making those 2 Tac Ops unscorable. So that's something to keep in mind, which can be a little bit difficult for players, because especially if you're not keeping in mind of the Tac Ops, now you have to keep in mind of that. And then another thing is, I don't like putting terrain where in such a place where it's overlapping objectives. So I can show it better in the little bit. But basically, like you've got the Octarius L-shaped terrain. I don't like putting the terrain over the 2-inch bubble to hold that objective, because you can have things where, especially if you're not playing with doors, you can have such a thing where someone can hide outside a line of sight and still be controlling that objective. And the only way you can stop your opponent by doing that is moving all the way around and charging or shooting them, which is much harder than it sounds. So I like keeping objectives kind of open, especially if they are more difficult, if they're more closer to the middle ground, because you kind of want the objectives that are closer to your drop zone a little bit safer, like maybe with some light terrain. But generally I would never put terrain underneath. I would never put terrain on top of an objective marker, and I would, depending on the mission, you can kind of go within 2 if it's got like, oh, you have to be within 1 inch of the center to do mission action. So maybe you can put the terrain overlapping, so that's on top of the bubble, but I would never put a terrain over objectives, because it causes more trouble than you'd realize. And then the other thing is, I like to keep drop zones safe. So this is something I've been noticing with a lot of boards from like across tournaments and like internationally, is people will basically put all the terrain in the middle, which is great, but the drop zones only have like 1 or 2 pieces and are relying on the obscuring to keep you safe. But the problem you have is, if you're facing kill teams that can move up the board very quickly or can advance deploy to teleport in, they can do crazy turn 1 alpha strikes, which you kind of have no way to defend, especially if you are a larger kill team with like 10 or more operatives. And the way I get around that is just try and focus more of your terrain to keep the drop zone safe, but make it going out into the board more risky. And I wouldn't make it so that there's no terrain in the middle. Try and have at least like a third, like at least a half of the drop zone safe. Even going closer to 2/3 or 3/4 is pretty good. Because the thing is, if you kind of do it right, you can encourage the use of barricades. Because I think if you've designed the boards right, you can make barricades a really interesting choice. So like when I'm playing on Warhammer World boards or my own boards, sometimes I'll now pick a third barricade, just because, not because I've used a barricade to keep my drop zone safe, but I've gone, now I can keep like, because my drop zone is actually quite safe, I can now use 3 barricades to keep the 3 objectives I want to go onto safe if I want to move up and be in terrain or concealed. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Oh, and the other point I missed about terrain is trying to have some heavy terrain in such a way to block fire lanes, because the key thing about heavy terrain, cover lines are 3D, so you kind of want at least one big central piece blocking line of sight or visibility in the middle of the board. So this can either be like a long, tall, heavy wall or big tower, remembering in such a way where it's not blocking off central control. And if you have something like a large tower in the center, which is just a large piece of heavy terrain, what I like to do, if it would block off central control, if it was directly in the middle, I'll put it to one side and then build the terrain around it. So what you have is go like, okay, I can't score central control from like this half of the board, but I can score on the other side. So it does make central control a little tougher to score, but at the end of the day, forcing people into the middle to fight over central control is really good. as long as it keeps the boards safe from being shot apart from the other side. Because the worst thing you can have is where, you know, there's advantage on one drop zone, advantage on the other, and all the light side on, like, light cover on the opposite side is just exposed, so your opponent can get shot from the other side. Having some nice heavy obscuring terrain, because remember, as long as your cover line crosses the heavy terrain and you're more than white away, you're obscured so you can't shoot. So you could be unengaged and your opponent can't shoot you because there's a nice blocking heavy line of sight terrain. That's another point to keep in mind, which relates back to, you know, keeping in mind the Tac Ops for your objective. And then the final thing, which is an optional one, if you're designing asymmetrical boards, what I like to do, instead of going, this side has 2 vantages, this side has 1, it's something I was discussing with Steve Wren from the Warhammer World Events team, which he started doing first and I really liked because we were like bouncing ideas off each other. And he was saying, why not make one board side easier to get to the objectives, whereas one is more defendable but kind of boxes you in. So I've seen some people do it for the London Wargaming Guild tournaments, which is really cool as well, where basically the board sides are kind of similar, but what makes it different is one side doesn't have really great shooting angles, but can get to the objectives much easily compared to the other side, which is more defendable but boxes you in. So you kind of go, oh, I'll castle up. But then if it's something like escalating hostilities, you're in a situation where you've castled up, but now the objectives have moved in such a way where you actually can't get to them. Or even if it's like loot and salvage, you know, you can stay pretty safe, but if you want to actually go to claim the objectives, you're in a spot where you actually can't do that. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, with all those core points, I'll just quickly show a video where I've set up a board of Octarius terrain as how I would do it, and then just going over the points and giving a good example to you all at home. Okay, as I've clarified, well, in the video with the points I've made, this is kind of like an example board I'd go for. So it's got a nice mix of heavy, light terrain, and, you know, it's got some unique pieces with the free scramble pieces. It's on a seize ground mission because the important thing to remember is you put the objectives first, then design the terrain. But as you can see from this angle, I've got a nice piece of heavy blocking the middle, which is in a way where it won't stop central control, but it still doesn't make it easy. But the important thing is it's in the middle to block fire lanes, so you can't have someone shooting across the board easily. There's still some safety for light cover, because the worst thing you want to have, even though you've got a kind of symmetrical setup, this is still asymmetrical. And the way I've done it is you've got 5 vantage points. You do have the option with Octarius to assemble 2 of the big L shapes without roofs, which does help a lot. But if you don't, this is another good way. Like if I have a vantage point touching the drop zones, because these drop zones are 3 inches deep or blue deep. So the way I've done it is the vantage points that are really easy to get to are exposed to the enemy. Whereas the ones that are, you know, give you a more advantageous position are sticking out more. So sure, you can go up there and get a more defendable shot. But the flip side is it's easier for the opponent to come and punish you, because the worst thing you have is drops like vantage points in drop zones, and they're facing with the light cover towards the opponent. So it just means the issue is if you have someone with like who can fire silent, they basically become undealable unless you have like grenades, indirect weapons, or fast melee. Or yeah, well, that's pretty much it. And you know, I've kept in my core route. So as I said, I'm not blocking off central control. I've got a nice way to score vantage because in this board there are five ways. Generally, if I'm playing with Octarius, I'll block off 2 of the roofs, so there's only 3 vantage points, but it still keeps that, you know, that vantage is scorable. So vantage and central control are still scorable. You know, there's nothing prevented. I believe even like seize ground is doable. But the important thing is there's no vantage points in drop zones. I've kept off the objectives, but the terrain off of the objectives. So you can't see it too well here, but it's basically none of the terrain is touching an objective marker. The only exception I've made is in the middle, but I've countered that by putting 2 scramble pieces on either side. So it's easy to contest and shoot over, but to charge, you're going to have to be a bit careful. But I like objectives that are more open, with better defendable drop zones. And the key thing here, you may say like, oh, you know, John, they're like, this objective's super open and this is, but you can put barricades there, and yes, they can be punished by the vantage points, but if you get up there, you're going to be shot back. So there's a nice counterplay. It opens up more if you're playing with doors, but it's just showing off how I would do one of my example boards just with an Octarius set, because I think Octarius is the best translatable example, because that's what most people have, and it's a good standard for kill team terrain. And as you can see, I've made the drop zones nice and defensible. So, you know, you've got each piece has at least one long piece of light cover. You've got a nice piece of light cover here to make crossing over a little bit more difficult unless you're walking around. It's still traversable. But the important thing is you're still safe in your drop zones, and you can kind of extend the safety by putting another barricade. So making, you know, encouraging the use of the scouting option 1, which is barricade, to place an extra barricade, because you may go, I'll place a barricade, you know, around this side. But the other cool thing is to remember you have obscuring from heavy. So you can sit on engage around here, and you can even use this piece. Like, for example, you know, you may put a barricade then and you can move up, because, you know, you won't be getting shot from this direction. And if they try and shoot you from here, they actually have to go to that point there because, well, this is heavy and it's in the way. So generally, you're actually quite safe. And I think that's how you should do a board. There's other ways, like it's a lot easier if you block out the 2 roofs, and then you could do something like by having more light in the drop zones and putting heavy more in the middle. But there's no real clear fire lanes that are safe, because if you're going to do a clear, like get out to get a shot along this direction, you're gonna have to be in the open, and the vantage points aren't exactly too safe. The only safe side is here, but then I think that's kind of fine to make this an interesting engagement, because you have the choice of either rushing to contest the other vantage point, or do you just try and swarm the objective? But I think that's a good example, like keeping in all key principles. And yeah, the main thing is I wouldn't use this for every kind of mission. You need to keep in mind that, importantly, you place the objectives first, then build the terrain around it. But that's pretty much how I do it. And yeah, the only thing I'm not using when I'm playing Octarius are the little platforms with the bridges. You don't really need those. I find they kind of make Octarius terrain really odd unless you're using it to just extend the platforms here, you know. But yeah, that's pretty much it, and I'll get back to the video. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope that video made sense in terms of what I've done with terrain. I will do an article version of this. I haven't done it this time because I haven't had time. I only had time to do the video, I'm afraid. But that's the key principles when I approach terrain, because it's not clear. It took me a long time, and there's a lot of interpretations, and nothing's really right or wrong. And I've tried not to use set pieces of terrain, because the biggest problem is, depending on who you are and where you are in the world, having terrain is not a luxury. You either have what you have, or you know, obviously using Octarius and kill team dedicated terrain, which is mainly just Octarius, which is great. But if you don't have access to that, you can still mix it up. Like, you know, so having a nice mix of heavy, light, remembering how to use obscuring, and just making sure the drop zones are safe, keeping those core principles so objectives aren't blocked by terrain. So you have stuff where, like, you know, your opponent is controlling an objective while having no risk of being shot at or attacked back. That kind of stuff, you know, making sure Tac Ops are still scorable, whether you go asymmetrical or symmetrical. There's a lot of things to keep track of, and hopefully my video has helped, you know, make that easier for you. I wouldn't say it's the best or the worst, hopefully, but it's just how I do things. So hopefully it's made sense for you back at home. But that's pretty much it for this video. Please remember to like and subscribe as comment. Let me know what you thought of this video. Was it helpful, useful? Is there anything I've missed? You know, I think the only thing I've missed is showing off different types of boards, because I've got, you know, Octarius, Chalnath, Nakmund, and Morok. But, you know, you can always use stuff like other terrain, like other company terrain, MDF terrain. That's really good as well. 3D printed. You know, I've seen even like acetate plastic terrain, like being used in Infinity and stuff. And nothing's wrong. It's basically whatever you can have that works for you is good. And hopefully this is all applicable. And outside of that, I also have a Discord if you want to check, down in the episode description below for free, as well as a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. And it's thanks to my patrons I was able to do this video. So let me just quickly thank them. So for my adepts of the crit, I have Samaru, Tarun, Kenzie, John Thomas, Average Joe, and Adzik. And then for my veterans of the crit, I have Samja and Confucius. So thank you for all your support. Really means a lot. And I hope this video was what you hoped for. And just remember, if you're a patron, you know, I'm still open for what you can request for me to cover in August. And my August battle report for, as requested by the patrons, will be Legionary versus Pathfinders. And paying some up here, look, oh look, they're Alpha Legion. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll be back soon with more content. I might have some surprises coming up, but depends on what's delivered, you know. I've also played in some tournaments. I've won one as well. So I'll come back with some more tournaments and some more battle reports as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So until next time, no matter what the guide says, even if there is heavy terrain in the way, you can always roll a crit.